joined us. Hello, Jerry.
Hello, how are you, Ann?
Good to see you, Jerry. Or I can see your name right now. Good to see your name.
Yes.
And Montel, one of our commissioners.
And do we have to go on schedule what Eric just mentioned?
Yeah.
When we go
Let's
live?
go ahead and start. Paul, if you want to go ahead and call the meeting to order. And
Okay. In that case, welcome everybody to our October Public Safety Commission meeting. Before we proceed any further in the meeting, I do have 3 new commissioners to introduce. Mr. Cornell Collins, if you can wave or something. Ms. Leslie Post-Wessinger, I got that right. And Ms. Melissa Villegas. I think I saw her before. There she is. We can wave. Okay. This is an unusual set of meetings we're going to have. Obviously, it's unusual just to be in a virtual meeting. But as you can see from the agenda, we're only going to have one item on the agenda basically for the next 5 meetings. We'll dispense with some of the other items. We'll pick them up again when these sessions are over. You did get minutes, those who are on the commission. If there's any additions or corrections, let me know. If not, the minutes will stand as written, and we thank the staff for writing the minutes. And Dennis is going to be taking over at this point because she is going to be our liaison to the village in addition to the others, and she will be actually putting this together as we go along, I think. Am I correct, Ann?
yes, you are.
And so this first meeting is a meeting to introduce to us the documents from the police department. And I'm now going to turn the meeting over to Ann.
Thank you, Paul. I am going to, first order of business I need to do is to read a statement for the record, and then I have about 3 or 4 minutes worth of comments, and then I'm going to turn this over to the Skokie Police, my colleagues in the Skokie Police Department. So this is a notice about the format of our meeting tonight relative to the Open Meetings Act. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this meeting is being held virtually. Members of the public who wish to comment as to an item on the published agenda must submit their statement or question in writing to Eric Cook at eric.cook@skokie.org, and all properly submitted statements or questions will be presented and read during the relevant portion of the meeting. Eric Cook is ERIK.Cook, COOK, @skokie.org. Written comments also may be submitted by email to citizencomments@skokie.org, by mail to Village of Skokie, attention Eric Cook, 5127 Oakton Street, Skokie, Illinois, 60077, or in writing via the village's drop box, which is located by the public entry to Village Hall on the west side of the building. With that housekeeping out of the way, I would like to welcome everyone and express my thanks to each of you for your commitment to this very important community project. We have a large group tonight. The first thing that I would like to do is ask my colleague Brian Baker to kindly share us. He is going to share his screen briefly on my behalf, because I would like to read to you the Obama pledge that Mayor Van Duzen took earlier this summer that was the impetus for the initiative that we're beginning on tonight. So earlier this year, Mayor George Van Duzen took the Obama Foundation's Reimagining Policing Pledge and committed the Village of Skokie to taking 4 specific actions recommended by the My Brother's Keeper Alliance that is part of the Obama Foundation. The pledge lists the following actions that are intended to examine public safety policies through an equity lens. Number 1, review your police of force policies. Let me say that again so I can be accurate and precise. Review your police use of force policies. Engage your communities by including a diverse range of input, experiences, and stories in your review. Report the findings of your review to your community and seek feedback. Reform your community's police use of force policies. Brian, if you would kindly stop sharing the screen, that would be great. I have been asked to, by one of our participants, to mute everyone. I am going to do that now. I will be unmuting people, my colleagues, when they will be speaking, and then towards the end, I'll be unmuting people again. Just to continue on with some background about this evening, our meeting tonight will center on a presentation by representatives of the Skokie Police Department, and there will be time at the end, a brief amount of time, for questions. Tonight's session with this large group will be followed by 4 smaller discussion sessions when members of the Public Safety and Human Relations Commission members, along with village staff, will listen to the community representatives' thoughts on the Skokie Police Department's current use of force policy that will be discussed tonight, and it also was issued by email to all participants. Some of you got it Friday, some of the commissioners have had it for about a month now. During those smaller discussions that occur from November, December, January, and February, the discussions will center around 3 questions that will be posed to the smaller groups to help shape conversations. You'll receive those questions in advance, and there will be ample time. Those meetings in November, December, January, and February truly will be listening sessions. And again, there'll be smaller groups, and we will hear from you, your thoughts on the Skokie Police Department use of force policy. After tonight's meeting, all of the participating groups will be invited to sign up in pairs. Some groups only have 1 representative, others have 2. And we will ask you to sign up either as an individual if you are the only person from your group, or in a pair if you're part of a duo representing one of our community groups. But we'll be asking you to sign up for one of the meetings. All of the meetings will be held virtually beginning at 7 p.m. on the 3rd Wednesdays of each month. The meetings, as is this one, will be open for the public to view on the village's YouTube channel and on Skokie's 2 cable channels, 17 and 25, depending on what cable system you have. The videos also will be archived on the village's YouTube channel. In addition to being invited to sign up for one of the next 4 meetings, members of the community groups also will be invited to register as individuals for either a ride-along with the Skokie police officer or to participate in a reality-based use of force training scenario at the Skokie Police Department. Please understand that all of these activities will be conducted in accordance with all current COVID-19 safety protocols. I would like to just very quickly, for the record, read the, I regret that time just will not allow us to introduce everyone this evening, but what I would like to do tonight is to just say the names of the groups that are represented here tonight. School District 65, 69, 72, 73, 73 and a half. We have 2 students from District 219, 1 each from Niles North and Niles West. The Assyrian National Council of Illinois, the ELL Parent Center, Insight Church, the Laurel Park Neighbors, the MCC Academy, the NAACP, the Niles Township Clergy Forum, the SEED alumni, and Skokie United. So those are the groups, in addition to members of the Public Safety and Human Relations Commissioners who are here tonight, and that includes several of our village trustees, Trustees Edie Sue Sutkar, Randy Roberts I see, I'm not sure if Trustee Alonka Ulrich also is on, and the village's staff liaison. I'd like to thank all of you again for volunteering to participate in this most important community project. We're together over the course of the next 4 months, and really it's going to continue on into the spring, where we together will conduct a review of the Skokie Police Department's use of force policy. Before I turn the meeting over to my colleague, Deputy Police Chief Brian Baker. I would like to just take a moment because I know it's going to be a long evening and I don't want to forget this. But I'd like to congratulate our Police Chief, Tony Scarpelli. Chief Scarpelli is retiring from over 3 decades of service with the Village of Skokie on November 10th. So this is his last Public Safety Commission meeting. And I know that you all join me in congratulating him on his retirement and wishing him well. He's not a lame duck. He's going to be here with us for almost not quite another month yet. But I didn't want the evening to go by without recognizing his service to the community and thanking him. So with that said, Deputy Chief Baker, I am going to if you want to maybe go ahead and unmute yourself, Brian. Yeah, you can unmute yourself. And if you would go ahead, Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Certainly. Thank you, Ann. Good evening, everybody. Sergeant Franklin, if you could please share your slides. Thank you. I'm just going to begin real quick, and then I'm going to hand it over to Sergeant Franklin, and then I'll pick up again later. But I'd like to welcome all of you once again and piggyback on what Ann said, on thanking you for your time and your commitment to this very, very worthwhile cause that, from the whole police department. And I just want to real quick run through the agenda we're going to walk through tonight. So if you go to the next slide, Sergeant Franklin. We're going to begin with some words from our Chief of Police about our principles and values and our philosophy and how we approach our work. Then Sergeant Franklin's going to take over and talk about our community engagement efforts that we currently have in place, what we've done for years, our outreach, and how we connect with the community. She's then going to talk about our crisis intervention team training, which some of you may have heard about and some of you may not have, but it's really an important initiative that we've been undergoing for the last couple of years. And then I'm going to jump into the weeds with you on use of force. We're going to walk our way through the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, Illinois statutes, the legal system that we have to deal with from the police department perspective, the current standards when we talk about federal law and how it applies to our use of force. And then we're going to review very thoroughly our use of force policy. I'll try not to bore the heck out of you, but it's very important that you understand it for the work that you have to do. And I will hopefully help you come to that understanding. We'll talk a little bit about the training that we as police officers here at the Skokie Police Department go through in our different phases of our careers with regard to use of force. And then we'll wrap up with some statistics on our Skokie experience with our use of force over the last several years. So with that, Chief Scarpelli, you could jump right on in.
Well, hopefully I've successfully unmuted myself. Ian is smiling, so so far so good. But I just wanted to also welcome everybody, not only for coming tonight, but participating in the process over the next several months. We truly appreciate citizen engagement. And in the interest of time, I do want to make some brief remarks, but they will be brief because there's a lot of material to cover. So I just wanted to talk just a little bit about, our principles, values, and philosophy. We sincerely desire to treat every person with dignity and respect, as well as sensitivity and compassion. Our mantra is professionalism always. The community, we view all of it as our partners. We truly can't perform our mission to the community without everyone's support. We also see ourselves as guardians for everybody that reside or pass through the village. Anybody who's done some research, there's some material out there on guardian mentality versus warrior mentality, and we promote guardian mentality. We also value doing what is right all the time, not some of the time, literally all of the time, and leveraging all available resources at our disposal to reach the best possible outcome all of the time. We always promote and support de-escalation techniques as well as procedural justice, and only utilizing force when it's absolutely necessary. So with that, I will, I believe, turn it over to Denise Franklin, who will share additional information, and then Deputy Chief Baker. Sergeant Franklin.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sergeant Denise Franklin, and I've been with the Skokie Police Department for 17 years. My current assignment right now is Supervisor of Support Services, along with Crime Prevention and Community Relations. Today we'll be talking about community outreach. Just going over each slide. All right, so community outreach. The Skokie Police Department is committed to building and maintaining strong community ties. The responsibility for achieving this goal is shared by all members of the department. Community outreach involves, among other things, educating and informing citizens, listening to citizens, promoting interaction through police department programs, and developing relationships with citizens through positive interaction and community partnerships. The Beat Officer Program. The Skokie Police Department has permanently assigned officers are permanently assigned for a one-year period. It promotes the building of relationships between the officer, residents, and business owners in a beat. It gives the residents and business owners a direct contact, and the beat workload is regularly reviewed. And you can contact your beat officer by telephone or by email, and you can find that information at www.skokiepolice.org. The Neighborhood Watch. Neighbors watching out for one another. Partnering with the community through a Neighborhood Watch captain as a liaison, the Neighborhood Watch program is constantly expanding in an effort to prevent crime. Goals of the program include increasing the awareness and reporting of suspicious activity in the community. It includes individual block captains, presentations, and a yearly block captain meeting at the police department. Currently, there are 262 individual blocks, and the coordinator for the Neighborhood Watch program is Officer Wilkin. Many cultures, one community, keeping Skokie safe. Originally established in 2015, focusing on two specific geographic areas in the village. Leverage at all the resources of the village to establish relationships, listen and provide resources to and those that live there. Police department fielded additional officers assigned specifically to the areas in conjunction with members of other village departments. The Skokie Police Library, Skokie Park District, houses of worship, social service agencies, and other organizations. It was expanded over time to include parks, block parties, community events, etc. And police department averages 4,000 citizen contacts during this program each summer. It's a great way to connect with the community. Citizens Police Academy. This started in 1996. The Skokie Police Department has graduated 38 sessions of CPA. Total number of alumni are over 800. It's a 12-week program covering a wide variety of topics, including criminal and civil law, evidence processing, use of force, investigations, and more. The students participate in a traffic stop and crime scene practical exercises, which offer a better understanding of what officers experience on a daily basis. Students are given a police station tour and offered a police ride-along. And one of the great things about this is after when you successfully complete the program, we have a graduation ceremony. So it's really great to hear the feedback from all of the students, and it's quite positive. Just they're able to see what's behind the scenes. National Night Out. It's held nationwide on the first Tuesday of August. This annual community building campaign promotes police community partnerships and neighborhood camaraderie to make this community a safer, more caring place to live and work. I was really bummed out that we didn't have a chance to do it this year because I really do enjoy this event. You get to, see children, local business owners, just residents having fun and listening to music. It's really fun. The Police Explorers. Founded in 1985, 164 individuals have participated in the program. an introductory program providing firsthand experience to young men and women 14 through 21 years of age interested in a career in law enforcement. Explorers meet twice a month, and the explorers provide hundreds of hours of volunteer time at many community events. They've volunteered at National Night Out, our Halloween events, and just certain other events throughout the community. Chat with the Chief. At all Wednesdays on the Green, events between Skokie Village Hall and Skokie Public Library. It's an opportunity for residents, police department members, and community leaders to gather in a comfortable setting to build relationships and discuss community issues while listening to really awesome music. All right, TRIAD. It's a program designed for our senior citizens. TRIAD references the three disciplines involved: law enforcement, criminal justice, aging services. The meetings involve dialogue regarding the delivery of law enforcement services, community involvement, victimization, and other pertinent topics. And the main issue is just promoting senior safety. We provide information about financial scams, identity theft, and things like that, ways you can protect yourself. Cops with Kids. Police department volunteers raise money throughout the year that is used to purchase holiday gifts for children in need and their families. Children are nominated by Skokie Elementary Schools. The event began in 2014 and has been held every year at the Skokie Walmart. 2019 raised $14,000 benefiting 73 children and their families. Another great event where I get to see the children's the smiles, and the officers really enjoy it too. Neighborhood Integrity Program. Established in 2014, the Neighborhood Integrity Program has been used to strengthen the partnership between the village and rental property owners using the Residential Rental Unit Standards and Neighborhood Integrity Ordinance. With the goal of preventing and eliminating criminal activity at rental properties, the Neighborhood Standards Officer, who is Officer Marzigliano, and the village conduct landlord training seminars which highlight best practices for property management and address life safety code issues. Coffee with a Cop. Started in 2019 and it was hosted at a local coffee shop. It encourages police officers and residents to come together in an informal setting to discuss community issues and further build relationships. In 2019, we had about 20 officers and several citizens stopping on over. We shared a cup of coffee with them and we discussed traffic safety issues, and it was a really positive experience. Community Outreach Police Substation, COPS. It's a multi-use vehicle, command and control of large-scale events. The meeting space during community events such as the Festival of Cultures and Backlot Bash. Deployed to block parties during the summer, downtown Skokie Trick or Treat, and other community events. Crisis Intervention Team, CIT training. It's a 40-hour block of intensive instruction covering. Just listed off: mental illness, signs and symptoms, child and adolescent issues, geriatric issues, co-occurring disorders, substance abuse, verbal de-escalation and tactical response, returning veterans and PTSD, risk assessment and crisis intervention skills, law enforcement response and legal issues, medical conditions and psychotropic medications, autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities, and community resources. CIT benefits. Officers are better trained and educated in verbal de-escalation techniques. Use of force incidents are decreased, less victimless crime arrest, and arrest rates decreased for the mentally ill. Involuntary hospitalizations decrease while voluntary hospitalizations increase, and both officer and citizen likelihood of injury decrease. Between October 2016 and present, 54 Skokie police officers and other department personnel have completed the Crisis Intervention Team training. myself included. The ultimate goal is to have all sworn officers, dispatchers, and community service officers trained. And lastly, leveraging community resources, community development block grant. The Skokie Police Department, along with the village, has a partnership with these agencies. We work hand in hand to improve the quality of life of the village. So these are just the list of all the agencies that we work with. In 2019, raised $208,000, $960,000, and over $5.3 million in total since the program, since the grant has been issued. And that is it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sergeant Franklin. I'm going to
I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Chief Baker. Mm-hmm.
bear with me one moment. Sorry about this. This is not how it went when we practiced. All right. All right, I'm getting closer.
You persevered. Thanks, Brian. It's not easy when you've got 50 people staring at you and
Sorry about that.
Good job.
All right, so the first confession I have to make, besides not being as technically savvy as I should have been right there, is that I'm not a lawyer. I won't pretend to be. I certainly don't have anywhere near the level of knowledge that a lawyer would have on a subject of law, but I can tell you that I have been a student of the law, especially criminal law as it applies to police, for 26 years. And as is every other police officer, we are students of that law. And we do our very best and commit ourselves to knowing what it is, knowing how to apply it in the different circumstances that we come across on a daily basis, and always doing the right thing when it comes to that application. My goal here tonight is to give you a good baseline understanding of what we have to consider from a perspective of the law and what our policy has laid out for us in applying that on a daily basis. So hopefully, once I am done with this, I come close to the goal, and we'll do our best to answer any questions you may have with the time that we have left, and then we'll move on. The first place we have to start is with the Fourth Amendment. Since the mid to late 1980s, with the decisions of two cases, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided police officer use of force issues using the Fourth Amendment. Prior to that time, it was not always the Fourth Amendment. It actually resided in several different areas of the law, most of that in the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause. But after the 80s, it's all been the Fourth Amendment ever since. So it's very important from an application standpoint that all of you understand that the Fourth Amendment rules when it comes to police officers' use of force and what the courts use to decide whether or not we are reasonable in what we do or not. So the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Now the Fourth Amendment applies to searches as well as seizures. We're only going to be talking about seizures. The U.S. Supreme Court has stated that when a police officer uses force on an individual, it is in fact a seizure, and therefore the Fourth Amendment applies. So that's federal law, and that's the amendment that applies to police officers' use of force from a federal perspective. I now want to go over Illinois state law and the Illinois state statute that outlines when a police officer may use force to make an arrest in Illinois. This is a verbatim copy and paste of the actual statute for the use of force in the state of Illinois. So peace officer's use of force in making an arrest, a peace officer or any person whom he has summoned or directed to assist him need not retreat or desist from making efforts to make a lawful arrest because of resistance or threatened resistance to the arrest. He's justified in the use of any force which he reasonably believes to be necessary to effect the arrest, and of any force which he reasonably believes to be necessary to defend himself or another from bodily harm while making that arrest. However, he is justified in using force likely to cause death or great bodily harm only when he reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or such other person, or when he reasonably believes both that such force is necessary to prevent the arrest from being defeated by resistance or escape, and one of the following is present. Either the person to be arrested has committed or attempted a forcible felony. Forcible felonies are those felonies which are deemed by law to be more violent, if you will, or more dangerous, if you will. They consist of, I believe, I don't know exactly how many, but it's murder, aggravated battery, kidnapping, robbery. Those kinds of offenses are forcible felonies. So a forcible felony which involves the infliction or threatened infliction of great bodily harm, or is attempting to escape by use of a deadly weapon, or otherwise indicates that he will endanger human life or inflict great bodily harm unless arrested without delay. Or a peace officer making an arrest pursuant to an invalid, there's no order. A peace officer making an arrest pursuant to an invalid warrant is justified in the use of any force which he would be justified in using if the warrant were in fact valid. That's what we call the good faith clause. So if we believe there's a warrant and we act on that in good faith, the law says that we're authorized and legal in using force to affect that warrant, even though it's not valid, because we don't know that at the time. That is a mouthful, I could say the least. And there's a lot of different pieces in there. So what I wanted to do is kind of dissect it a little bit and go over it one more time and just pick out those things that are most important. So this is the same thing you just looked at, but just kind of with the key points. Police officers in Illinois need not retreat or desist from efforts to make a lawful arrest because of resistance or threatened resistance to the arrest. So just because someone resists doesn't mean we have to stop our efforts to arrest them, is basically what that says. We're justified in the use of any force which we reasonably believe to be necessary to effect the arrest. The key word there is reasonably believes to be necessary. And we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. And you have seen that both from the Fourth Amendment and now from Illinois statute, and you'll keep seeing it anytime you talk about law and police officer use of force. You will always see reasonably believes, a reasonable belief. It's referenced, and like I said, we'll talk about that shortly. Police officers are justified in the use of any force which they reasonably believe to be necessary to defend themselves or somebody else from bodily harm while making that arrest. And they're justified in using force likely to cause death or great bodily harm only when they reasonably believe that that force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to themselves or somebody else. And then we're going to get into some further exceptions on the use of deadly force next. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but just to highlight, part of our policy here at the police department is more restrictive than the state of Illinois statute, and this is that part. So you can, a peace officer may also use death or great bodily harm, use force likely to cause death or great bodily harm, when the person to be arrested has committed or attempted a forcible felony, which involves the infliction or threatened infliction of great bodily harm. So if they committed a felony for robbery and they shot the person, for example, during the robbery, and now they are fleeing, an officer under state law may use deadly force. If they're attempting to flee or escape by the use of a deadly weapon. The courts have ruled the term use of a deadly weapon to mean that if that weapon is in their hand, and or otherwise indicates that that person will endanger human life or inflict great bodily harm unless arrested without delay, all of those circumstances, a officer may, under state law, use deadly force, in addition to the ones up above. This is also an Illinois state statute that has to do with involuntary admissions. A lot of times we are called to people's homes and workplaces and the public at large on the streets and within the village to deal with individuals that have mental illness. And in those cases, a lot of times they need treatment. And a lot of times they, because of the way they are acting and what they are doing, they are putting themselves in harm's way, or they are also putting others in harm's way. So there's a statute, a law in Illinois, which allows anyone really to file a petition once you document the facts and the reasons why you believe someone else is a danger to themselves or someone else, and have that person admitted for evaluation on whether or not they are of a good mental status, and to get them the help that they need so they're not a danger to themselves or somebody else. This is the statute that allows that petition to be executed and to give that authority to take that person involuntarily. The next statute is the statute that applies to peace officers, to us, that allows us to take custody of those individuals and to take them for their treatment. So someone else can utilize the previous statute, fill out an involuntary committal on an individual, phone us and tell us that they did this and the person is here and we would like the police to go get them and take them to treatment. This happens quite frequently. And this is the statute that gives us the authority under the law to take custody of them and to take them for treatment. Now I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about our legal system and how the courts work with regard to police officer use of force and how what we call case law is developed. So we've talked about the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and the federal law when it comes to police officer use of force. And we've talked about the Illinois state statutes about when it comes to Illinois police officers' use of force. So if there's ever an instance when a law enforcement officer in the state of Illinois uses force and the person that force is used upon does not think that was reasonable, they can file suit either on the federal side or they can seek a prosecution on the state side. And those cases can work their way through the federal court system or the state court system. And as they work their way through those systems, you see them depicted on the slide here, they can be resolved at any given level. But when they're resolved and decided by a judge, and there's a decision, we, as the police officers, are bound to know what those decisions are, and those decisions establish rules on when we are confronted with circumstances that are similar to those cases. Though we have to know what they are, and we have to abide by those rulings. So, for example, you have an officer from Skokie, for example, because we're talking about us, that makes an arrest. He uses force. There's a suit filed in federal court under the Fourth Amendment saying that that amount of force is unreasonable, and makes its way through the court system. And say at the 7th District, it is decided that the officer did in fact use reasonable force under these circumstances, whatever those circumstances are. Now, any officer in the 7th District can reference that set of circumstances and knows that when he has confronted those in the field that are similar, he can act in the same way and be assured that what he's doing is reasonable, if that makes sense. It's kind of a complicated way to come up with a rule book on how you act, but that's the system that we have. When we talk about, I mentioned the 7th District, the United States is divided up into districts for federal law. We reside in the 7th. So the 7th District hears the cases that come up through Skokie and Illinois. And then from there, they would go to the Supreme Court. We are bound, as police officers in the state of Illinois, we are bound by cases that are decided at the 7th District because that is our district. If a case is heard in the 9th District in California and there's a ruling on that case, we are not bound by that decision because it's a different district. However, it's always a good idea for us to be aware of what cases are being heard in other districts and what those circumstances are and those decisions, because a lot of times it's likely that other districts in the same circumstance may rule the same way. So we definitely keep an eye on what happens in other districts, but we definitely are bound by the 7th. And then any decision by the U.S. Supreme Court applies to every police officer in the country. So once they make a decision on a case, on a set of circumstances, we are bound by that when we meet those similar circumstances in the field, what they say is reasonable or is not reasonable. And just to give you an example of how this plays out, years ago when tasers first came to be popular, more and more departments got them, there weren't a whole lot of rules that we had given by the courts because they're new on what was reasonable and what wasn't. So there's a lot of case law that was developed that now tells us we can only use tasers when we have someone that is actively presenting a threat to somebody. Those rulings came out of the fact that police officers used tasers on people that were not actively presenting a threat, and the courts heard those cases and said, no, that's not reasonable. And those rules were then defined through case law. When we talk about use of force from a federal standard, I mentioned that in the 80s, things changed to the Fourth Amendment. These are the two cases that really made those changes. And these are the two cases that still today define the standard for which the courts decide what we do is reasonable or not reasonable. The first one is Tennessee versus Garner, which was heard in 1985 by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that was a case of a individual that had committed a burglary and was fleeing the scene, and the police officers in Tennessee used deadly force and killed the subject that was fleeing away from the burglary. And basically what that case said in the end is that we, the court, the U.S. Supreme Court, we don't think it's reasonable for a fleeing criminal that is of no danger to anyone else at that moment in time to be the subject of deadly force. So that created the rule that if you're going to use deadly force to prevent the escape of a fleeing suspect, that fleeing suspect has got to present a significant threat of death or serious physical injury to someone right then and there, or imminently. And if that's present, then you can still use deadly force to prevent that from happening. But if that threat isn't present, you cannot. The next case was Graham versus Connor, which is in 1989. And it established the objective reasonableness standard for which every single use of force case is judged against to this day. One of the things that the court said in that decision was that when those cases are judged, they must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene at the time that the incident took place, knowing what that officer knew at the time that the incident took place. You can't judge it from a perspective of hindsight. It's not fair to learn information later and apply that to the officer's decision because you didn't know it at the time. So it clearly states in Graham that the decision has to be made based on what the officer knew at the time that the force was used. It also requires the court to envision a reasonable officer and ask this question based on the totality of the facts and circumstances. Did such an officer believe that the force that they used was reasonable? And that's the standard that was created through the Graham case in 1989. What they did in that case is they created a three-pronged test that courts use every time that they review a case that's brought before them to determine if the officer acted reasonably or not. Those three-pronged questions are the following. What is the severity of the crime at issue? Whether the person against whom the force was used presented an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, and whether the person against whom the force was used was actively resisting or attempting to evade arrest by flight. The severity of the crime is fairly straightforward. It runs the gamut. Everything from, is it a traffic stop for speeding versus apprehending someone for committing a homicide. That's the spectrum for which it could possibly fall into, right? The second one, when it talks about threat, whether the person against whom the force was used presented an immediate threat. It's not only do they present an immediate threat, but what level of threat is that? Is that person standing there saying, well, if you come over here and try to arrest me, I'm going to resist, and I'm going to beat you, and I'm going to fight you? Or is that person holding a gun and pointing it at the officer? Those are two very different threats. So there's a threat spectrum also that it could go from low to high. And then the last one, whether they're attempting to actively resist or evade arrest by flight, again, also has a spectrum. Are they actively assaulting the officer, trying to get away? Or are they merely holding their hands underneath their body and not letting them get handcuffed? So those three factors have, each one has a spectrum, if you will, that the court considers when it considers all three together in their totality to determine if an officer is reasonable or not. A lot of times when we talk about this issue with police officers and we train it, I like to use the reference of a three-legged stool. Think of a stool with three legs. Each one of these questions is a leg on the stool, and they're all, when you have the farthest range of spectrum on each one of them, you have a full leg of the stool, and they're all the same length. When reality sets in, you may have one that's not present, you may have one that falls somewhere in the middle of the scale, and you may have one that's really solid on the scale. But when you have that, your stool is not really stable, right? You can't sit on a three-legged stool with one of the legs only going halfway to the ground and the other one not even present. Your stool is wobbly. And when that takes place, we as police officers know that our level of force that we use has to be lower than the highest degree on the spectrum. We have to be careful. If we have a solid stool, we're usually in a good position to use force and under the law and apply it. What I'd like to do now is I've given you the basic background, if you will, on federal and state law as it pertains to police officers' use of force. And it's fairly complex and vague, unfortunately, but that's the system that we have. But out of that, we have a policy. So what I'm going to do now is go into our policy and work our way through our policy. Can everyone see that okay? And
Yeah, it looks good. We can name it.
so this is our police department use of force policy. And to begin with, this policy has been in effect since, well, we found hard copy records dating back to 1982. But we're fairly confident that there was a use of force policy that existed prior to that, probably back into the 60s. But we definitely found hard copies all the way back to 1982. We review this policy every single year. And look for updates that we can convey both from a law perspective and a application perspective. So to begin with, we'll just talk about our policy statement. So only the objectively reasonable use of force. So that's straight from the U.S. Supreme Court. The objectively reasonable wording is directly from the Fourth Amendment and Graham v. Connor and the Garner case. So only the objectively reasonable use of force required to effect an arrest or achieve other lawful objectives shall be used. Officers are justified in the use of deadly force only when they reasonably believe that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death to themselves or others, or to defend any person in imminent danger of great bodily harm. The reasonableness of the use of force must be based on the facts and circumstances known or perceived by the officer at the time of the incident. Because police officers are involved in tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving circumstances, interpretation of the reasonableness of an officer's use of force must include consideration of the split-second decisions officers make in deciding the type and level of force to be employed. All that is straight out of either the Illinois statute or the Graham v. Connor case and the justices' opinions out of that case. Our procedures are use of force in making an arrest. An officer is justified in the use of any force which he reasonably believes to be necessary to effect the arrest, and any force he reasonably believes to be necessary to defend himself or another from bodily harm while making the arrest. That's straight out of the state statute. That's the Illinois statute that's referenced right there. Officers may use force that is objectively reasonable on persons that they reasonably believe are a danger to themselves or others, in accordance with Department General Order F80, which is we have another policy that talks about dealing with mentally ill. In there, it references the state statutes we talked about earlier with the involuntary committals and our authority to take custody of them. So that's what that is talking about. This policy is more restrictive than state law in the use of force likely to cause death or great bodily harm. An officer may only use force likely to cause death or great bodily harm when the officer reasonably believes the action is in defense of human life, including the officer's own life, or in defense of any person in imminent danger or great bodily harm. If you recall, we went over the Illinois state statute and use of force on fleeing forcible felons. There was some wording in the Illinois statute that allowed use of deadly force against fleeing forcible felons. We are more restrictive than the state statute. We only allow use of deadly force against fleeing forcible felons or fleeing anyone if we reasonably believe that they are going to imminently cause great bodily harm or death to somebody else. If that is not present, we will not use deadly force on them. Next, it goes into what is objectively reasonable, and that's what we just talked about. This right here, the Graham versus Connor case, established by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it creates the three-pronged test. We've been over what those three questions are and the three-legged stool. All three factors must be assessed in the totality and considered when the use of force is applied. Again, you can very well have a circumstance where you don't have all three legs present. I just real quickly run through an example for you, so maybe you can try to understand how this is applied by officers on the street. So let's say, for example, we get a call from an elderly couple that live in town, and they have a adult child that lives with them that has mental illness, and from time to time they have episodes and lose control of the way they act. And on a given day, this happens, and the parents are concerned and they're worried, and they call the police, and we send an officer. And on the first scenario, we get there. If we apply the three-prong, we get there, the officer goes into the house, talks to the parents, talks to the individual, and finds out that he is in the corner of the room. He's not really responsive. He's broken some of the parents' stuff, but they don't really care. They just want to get him help, right? They want to get him treated and seen by a doctor. If we apply the Graham test to this scenario, when you talk about the crime that's been committed, there isn't one. There's been no crime committed. Had he damaged their property and they wanted to sign a complaint, you would have a very low level crime of criminal damage, right? But in this case, they don't care about the property. They're not going to sign a complaint. That leg of your stool is gone. When you talk about threat, what is the threat that he is posing to the parents or the officer at that time? And the answer is he's posing no threat, right? He just doesn't want, he wants to be left alone. And the fourth thing, what resistance is he providing or attempts to escape? And really all he's doing is being non-compliant. He's being asked to, he doesn't want to, but that's all you have. Our stool is extremely weak and wobbly and it doesn't have any legs at all. So the amount of force that we can use to get him to the hospital to get help is extremely low. We can't taser him. We can't hit him with a baton. We can't use lethal force, certainly, right? So that's how we apply the Graham factors to help us decide what level of force could be used. Now, if you take that same scenario and before the officers arrive, he picks up a knife and his dad goes to take it away from him and he stabs his dad. And now he's in the corner of the room with that knife. And we get there, our crime is now aggravated battery. It's a forcible felon. Our threat is the fact that he's now armed with a knife in the corner. Is he a threat to his parents? Yes, absolutely. He's already stabbed one of them. Is he a threat to us? Certainly, possibly. And what's his level of resistance? He's still non-compliant, but maybe he's making statements that he's not going to go anywhere, and he's going to make sure that we're not going to take him, and he'll use the knife. And you can see how those two scenarios, using those criteria, you come to a much different totality of circumstances that lets us know we're better. We can use more force on the one scenario than the other. I hope that helps everybody understand. When we talk about police officers must frequently employ use of force techniques to effect arrests and ensure the public safety. It is not intended that a suspect should ever be allowed to be the first to exercise force, thus gaining an advantage in a physical confrontation. Further, nothing in this order should be interpreted to mean that an officer is required to engage in a prolonged physical fight before resorting to techniques that would more quickly, humanely, and safely bring an arrestee under physical control. And this is just basically saying that under the Graham factors and the totality of the circumstance, we don't require officers to utilize or get into a fight, for example, in an engagement with someone that is extremely dangerous, when it could be solved easier when the threat is present through some other means, is what that is saying. So if you have someone that is beginning to actively resist arrest, they are a threat, for example, we don't require them to get into a wrestling match with them. They can go straight to their taser, because the likelihood of resolving that in everyone's benefit better with a higher level of force. The next part of the policy talks about definitions. The first one is non-deadly force. Non-deadly force means any force that can reasonably be anticipated not to result in death or great bodily harm when applied. Non-deadly force includes, but is not limited to, pain compliance. Pain compliance are hand techniques, so you can do a wrist lock, for example, puts them in pain, and you get compliance that way. Control holds, punches, kicks, strikes. OC spray is oleo resin capsicum, more commonly known as pepper spray. And the baton is the batons that we use and carry on us for strikes. In the older days, those are the long clubs that the officers used to carry. Now they collapse and they're in a small pouch and you don't really even notice them. And then also extended range kinetic energy impact munitions. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but those are, think of those as a baton that's delivered through some sort of weapon system. So we have 12-gauge shotguns that shoot a beanbag round that acts like a baton from a distance. We also have other delivery systems that will shoot a impact round from a distance. It's like hitting them with a baton, but we don't have to get up close to them. So like someone that has a knife that might be threatening to hurt themselves, we don't want to walk up right next to them when they have the knife. We can try to employ these means to take them into custody, and which is safer for them and safer for us. Deadly force means any force that can reasonably be anticipated to result in death or great bodily harm when applied. For purposes of our order, this includes discharging a firearm in the direction of a person to be arrested, even though no intent exists to kill or inflict great bodily harm on that person. So anytime we fire our weapons at anybody or in the direction of anybody, it's considered deadly force. We have to be justified in the use of that deadly force. When it talks about even in the direction of the person, they're talking about warning shots, which used to be a thing way before I was a police officer, but it's not anymore. It has not been for a very long time. A firearm discharge response at a vehicle in which the person to be arrested is riding. What that is and there have been circumstances, I'm sure, in police departments over the years where officers have tried to shoot the tire off a vehicle to stop the vehicle. We do not allow that. The only thing we allow is if you are going to fire a weapon at a vehicle, you must be authorized in the use of deadly force against that individual that's in that vehicle. Use of chokeholds are not allowed. They never have been allowed in our department. Any response applied in any manner, by any means, by any member of the department that could reasonably be expected to cause death or great bodily harm. I just want to go back to chokeholds. This is saying that chokeholds, if you do them, are a use of deadly force, and you must be able to justify that use of deadly force. You can't use it other than for deadly force. And then anything else done by an officer that could reasonably be expected to cause death or great bodily harm. And you might be like, well, what could that be? One example might be you have a traffic stop on an individual. Immediately, someone hops out of that car and starts shooting at the officer. The officer's still behind the wheel of that car. We could use that car as a weapon. And that would be considered deadly force under this policy. The discharge of a firearm for the purposes of a warning shot is prohibited. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but that just makes it very clear. You will never shoot a warning shot. Physical response, defined under the policy, is a response physically applied by an officer upon the person of another beyond that which is normally needed to effect an arrest. Examples are control techniques. It's when we put our hands on people. Any punching or kicking or open hand strikes. Any physical response in this sense physical response in this sense shall not include use of lethal or less lethal weapons. We'll talk about lethal and less lethal weapons very soon. But basically, when we talk about physical response and what is normally needed to effect arrest, normally we walk up to somebody, you're under arrest, turn around, put your hands behind your back, we put handcuffs on them. That's normal. So anything beyond that is a physical response. Physical harm means any injury or illness or physiological impairment, regardless of the severity, is what we consider physical harm to someone. Great bodily harm or serious physical injury, as used in this policy, is defined as any physical harm which carries a substantial risk of death, or physical harm that involves permanent incapacity, or partial or total incapacity that involves some temporary substantial incapacity. Any physical harm that involves permanent disfigurement or that involves some temporary serious disfigurement. Excuse me. That definition in most of these comes straight out of the Illinois statutes, because the Illinois statutes reference great bodily harm in many crimes. Imminent danger refers to an impending violent act that an officer reasonably believes will occur based on the totality of the circumstances that they are aware of at the time. So now we move into intermediate weapons. Intermediate weapons constitute an intermediate use of force. So consistent with Graham v. Connor, the elevated use of force must be reasonable based on the totality of the three factors we've talked about. Based on court rulings, the defining factor on whether an officer's use of force is reasonable using an intermediate weapon is the presence of a direct threat to that officer, another officer, or a citizen. Absent that threat being present, increased scrutiny should be applied by the officer to the incident when determining whether to utilize an intermediate weapon. And you're probably saying to yourself, what is an intermediate weapon? Well, it's our police baton, it's our pepper spray, and it's our electronic control device, which is better known as the taser. So those three weapons, pepper spray, baton, and taser, are what we consider a intermediate weapon, and that's what the courts consider an intermediate weapon. And in order to use them, we have to have a higher level threat than normal. And we have to be able to justify their use involving that higher level threat than normal. And the most important factor out of those three things the court have said in utilizing an intermediate weapon is what is the threat. And that's been established through the case law system that we talked about earlier. Now this section of the policy gets into talking about our batons. It talks about the fact that we have batons. We regulate the types of batons that officers can carry, how long they are, the fact that they must be trained in their use. They no one can carry a baton if they haven't been trained in their use, and they can only carry batons that we approve. So they can't come in with their own, baton and utilize something that we have not authorized. Here it talks about the striking at an offender in the head with a police baton may cause death or serious physical injury, and therefore you can't do it unless you can justify the use of deadly force. We inspect our batons every year during training and during annual inspections to make sure that they're serviceable and that they work. Anytime anyone gets a new baton, it has to be inspected, and we add that item to the officer's inventory. And any use of the baton must be in accordance with Graham v. Connor, this policy, and the increased threat that is required in the use of an intermediate weapon. Then our policy goes into pepper spray, the OC spray, goes over the same types of conditions and requirements in terms of training, in terms of issuing, in terms of carrying. All that is regulated by us. And also talks about anyone that is sprayed with pepper spray will receive medical aid, or we will give them medical aid and flush them with copious amounts of water and clean them prior to doing anything else. And again, the use of OC spray must be justified, just like the time. And then we move on to ECDs, which again are tasers, and the same type of requirements. We have a whole separate policy that governs tasers in terms of procedures for the officers, how to inspect them, how to know they're working properly, how to load the cartridges, the required battery level, to make sure that everything works correctly. So when it comes to their use under the law, they're again an intermediate weapon, and that increased use of force has to be justified with an increased threat. Then we talk about self-defense in exigent circumstances, and we say only those weapons identified as authorized by this policy may be carried by officers on duty. They can't carry some other weapon that they think that they want to have. It's not allowed. This section is not intended to limit officer response options relating to implements ready at hand. So officers can't carry another weapon which is not regulated by us, but if they get into a situation where their life's in jeopardy, their weapon is taken away from them, and they find something that's near them that they can use, they can certainly use that by all means. But they can't ahead of time carry some weapon that is not authorized or regulated by us. Then we'll talk about less lethal weapon systems. These are the ones I talked about, the baton rounds, if you will, the baton that we deliver through different means. They're extended range kinetic energy impact munitions. It's like getting hit by a hard ball thrown by a really good pitcher. When used in combination with the extended range kinetic energy impact munitions, the Department 12 gauge and 37 millimeter, 40 millimeter launchers are the only approved delivery systems that we have here at the police department. Nobody can use anything else. Nobody can use any other ammunition than what we approve. And again, the people using those systems have to go through our training, have to be certified, have to qualify and show proficiency in their use prior to them being able to use it. We have a section in here where we regulate knives. The primary purpose of the knife is for the use of as a tool in the performance of an officer's duties. There's many circumstances where knives come in handy as a tool, and we just put in some conditions in which those knives must be met in order for them to carry them. Because we don't want someone an officer walking down the street with a foot-long bayonet on his side. Medical assistance, we have a whole part of policy here that talks about anytime we use force and someone is injured or reported to be injured or they complain about injury, we will get them medical assistance. We will give them assistance ourselves based on our level of knowledge, and we will call them help and get it there as soon as we can. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about giving anyone medical aid at any time. And then our reporting procedure is certainly, I would say, extremely proactive, if you will, or aggressive, if you will. If you remember back at the beginning of the policy, we talked about the definition of physical response. In our policy, under the reporting procedures, any application of any physical response requires the officer to do a report. So every time they do something other than ask them to turn around and put their hands behind their back and they put the handcuffs on, anything other than that, there's a written report done by the officer that details the circumstances, what happened, what they did, what the individual did in response, and why they had to do what they did. They have to justify every action. That goes into a report. It goes through the chain of command. It is reviewed against policy and the law, and we make a finding on whether that use by that officer was proper or not proper. And that is on every single one of them. So if you ever see any statistics on use of force from other agencies or other agencies, there really isn't a way to compare it to anyone else. There is no national standard, first of all. There's an initiative underway by the FBI to create the National Use of Force Reporting database. But the problem with that is it doesn't go anywhere near as far as ours does. It only requires the reporting if a fatality occurs, when there is a serious bodily injury, or when a firearm is discharged. Other than that, nothing has to get reported. So we are by far out in front, I think, in terms of our reporting and review and investigation of our uses of force to make sure they're done properly. Let's see. This all talks about the reporting procedure. Everybody got a copy of this. I'm sure you'll read through it, but I definitely hit all the highlights. Now training. It talks about training. No employee may carry any agency authorized weapon until they have received training and have demonstrated proficiency in its use. We talked about that previously. This includes instruction in this use of force policy, and I'll talk a little bit about training numbers here in just a minute. Police officers and CSOs shall receive in-service training at least annually on this order. Police officers and CSOs shall receive training and demonstrate proficiency with their authorized intermediate weapons as well. We talked about that also earlier. And that takes us through the end of our policy. So I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. When we talk about training, I said I'd run some numbers by you. So during a police officer's career here at the department, when they're in the academy, currently they get 72 hours of training out of the academy on use of force. So that's about 13% of the total academy time. Once they graduate the academy and they come back here to the police department, we have a program called Expanded Basic. It's a kind of a mini academy. They're not done learning and sitting in class. They come back here. They're really excited about that too. It's 6 weeks long. And in that, we give them 56 more hours of use of force training. It's 23% of that time that we commit. Once they get through that, every year for the rest of their career, they get a minimum of 24 hours by us in-house on use of force. That's 75% of our annually recurring training. We talked about case law and all the cases that are heard by the courts and the decisions that are made and that we have to know about those. We use a service called CourtSmart. It's done every month. We have lawyers write articles on cases that are heard, what those circumstances are, what the results are, whether it's reasonable or not reasonable. And those are in articles that go out to all of our officers. They read them every month and then they take a test. So we do that every month. That's how we stay up on what the cases are as they are decided. And then we also send our officers to outside agencies and outside facilities to receive additional use of force training. In 2019, that was a total of 920 hours for that whole year. So far in 2020, we've done 360 hours. Just as a note, for all of you to, in case you didn't know, the hiring, recruitment, and filling the vacancies for police officers is not done by the police department. It's done by a board of fire and police commissioners. They're civilians and residents of the village of Skokie that volunteer their time, and they're the ones that do our recruiting and fill our vacancies and hire our police officers. They also have the authority and responsibility to do that for promotions to the rank of sergeant. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about our experience. This chart shows our experience for the last 5 years in terms of use of force. So the large blue columns are showing all calls for service that the police department responds to. So if you look at 2019, at the end of the year, we responded to over 40,000 calls for service in the village. So that's everything from traffic accidents to customer disputes to crimes. Out of those 40,000 calls for service, we made 1,381 arrests in 2019. Out of those 1,381 arrests, 55 of those incidents we used force on. So it's an extremely small number of times that we use force in affecting arrests, and when you look at how often we interact with people. This slide shows that out of all the times that we use force, out of the 55 and 41 and 46 and 45 and 65 all added together, out of all of those, 79% of the time, all we're doing is putting our hands on people. And we're using maybe a wrist lock or an arm bar or some sort of control tactic or technique to get them under control. We're not using any weapons. We're not using intermediate weapons. 79% of the time, it's just putting our hands on people. So it's a very small percentage where we're doing something else. And then you can see what those percentages are. Just to highlight a couple things we didn't talk about, here's your pepper spray, here's your impact munitions, your 12-gauge beanbag rounds and your impact rounds, batons. This is your taser. We and the courts consider anytime you point a weapon, whether it's a taser or a firearm, directly at somebody that's a use of force. It's got to be reported. So you can't just go around pointing a weapon at someone and not be able to justify why you're doing it. And then the restraint chair is a piece of equipment that we have in our booking cells. We will, from time to time, get individuals that are not cooperative at all. They will bang their heads against the cement wall and booking and hurt themselves. They'll take all the toilet paper and cover up the cameras or whatever. And from time to time, we have to restrain them to prevent them from hurting themselves or to allow us to monitor them. And that's what the restraint chair is. Way back in the day, everyone used to use straitjackets. The restraint chair is a much better solution than the straitjackets ever were. Hobbles, we utilize, they're basically straps to hold people's ankles together. A lot of times we get someone that's extremely violent and resisting arrest or kicking, and they kick a lot. And to prevent them from kicking our officers and kicking the windows out of the cars, we'll use a hobble around their ankles. And that brings me to the conclusion of the use of force portion of the presentation. So I'll kick it back to you, Ann.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, both Denise, Brian, and certainly Chief Scarpelli. One footnote, just a very quick one before we entertain questions, and I have a sort of a point of order, a housekeeping request with the questions. But when Sergeant Franklin was giving her presentation, she talked about the cadet or oh, Brian, help me, Denise, help me, with the young people. It's the,
Explorers.
I'm sorry?
Explorers.
Yes, thank you, it's on my mind. I think it's noteworthy that we have several police officers and community service officers who were at one time Skokie high schoolers who went through that program and are now in our employ and are on our force. So we do have a little bit of time for questions. What I'd ask, since we do have such a large group, what I'd ask you to do is if you'd be kind enough to go into, on the very bottom, or you can raise your hand actually. There's a way through the, is it the participants? Let me see here. Chat, no. There's a way that you can actually raise your hands.
Participants, Ann.
Yes, in the participants. So if you do want to ask a question, if you'd be kind enough to indicate that by pressing that little button in the participant section, and then I'll call on you, and either you can unmute yourself or I will unmute you. So I am waiting, looking to see if anyone has raised their hands. While I'm looking, I would like to commend all of you. I see Karen Sherman has a question, so we'll start with you, Karen. But I'd like to quickly, I did a quick kind of a roll call on my own from my chart of participants, and I am really delighted to say that we have almost 100% participation. There's only one member from one of the community groups who could not be here tonight, and he had contacted me today. So again, just to express my gratitude and gratitude on behalf of my colleagues to all of you for participating. So with that said, Karen, if you would please go ahead and mute yourself and ask your question.
There, can you hear me?
Yes, great, thank you.
Good. Okay, real quick first, thank you so much for a really good presentation. I had read everything ahead of time and had a few questions, and you answered them while you covered the docs. But so here's the one question I still have, and it's regarding the use of force by type slide, the use of force by type experience. And that's the pie chart slide where you've got, the different things, the pepper spray, the tasers and so on. The one category, firearm, let me see if I can, firearm point. So there's 74 incidents of firearm point. And I think when you were just discussing it, you said that included both tasers and weapons. So I'm wondering, one, is there a breakdown between how many of those 74 are tasers versus actual weapon or guns, firearm, well, guns, they're both firearms, I guess. And if so, are they both intermediate level types of force, or is one, between the physical force and intermediate level and lethal but not deadly and deadly, where do they both fall? Are they both intermediate?
Thank you, Karen. Deputy Chief Baker, I assume you're going to take that one?
I will certainly. I'm going to throw that slide back up. That might help. Yep. So this is the one we're talking about. And you are referencing firearm point right here. 74. So 74 times over the last 5 years, police officers have pointed a firearm directly at an individual, is what that is. They didn't pull the trigger, but they pointed it.
Right, right.
That is not an intermediate level of force. That is a use of force as determined by the courts and as determined by us. They have to justify why they did that. A lot of these are when they are dealing directly with someone that is armed and has a gun. So say, for example, you have a robbery of a retail establishment that was done armed, and we have an officer that finds the car, pulls them over, we'll do a felony stop, and we'll call each person out of that car back, away from that car, because we know they're armed, we know they have guns, and we know the likely in the car. So it's those types of scenarios where those weapons are being pointed at people. I can tell you this is significantly improved over the years with training and with, well, primarily through training, but also through the courts saying that it is a use of force to point a weapon at someone. Because if you look at our numbers over history, they've gone down dramatically to where they're at today. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I was still wondering the difference between tasers or an officer's gun.
So a taser is a...
Like how many are of those 74, how many are tasers, how many are, a gun that would shoot bullets? Pardon my...
Yeah, the tasers are right here. So 32 times tasers were pointed and not fired.
Oh, okay.
Versus 74.
Oh, got it. Okay. And tasers are intermediate, right? But so what then is pointing a gun? Is that below intermediate level or is that?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Our lineup, just so everyone knows that they've been seen, we're going to take them in order. Willie Shaw next, then Carlton Evans, Maggie Vandermeer after that, Lawrence Walters, Melissa Villegas, and Laura Williams. And then if we still have time, we'll get to Jasmine. So Ms. Shaw, if you'd be kind enough to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, my question, by the way, I've learned a lot already, great presentation, so thank you very much. One question that I had in regards to the training, I didn't hear anything about sensitivity training or any cultural type training in the department. Is there any?
There certainly is. We have mandatory annual required training from cultural perspectives to dealing with mentally ill. We do quite a bit of training with that regard. The CIT training that Sergeant Franklin talked about covers a lot of that. So we do definitely conduct that training on a regular basis. I didn't have it in the numbers for you.
Mental health and what else? You said something else. I didn't hear that.
Cultural awareness.
Okay.
Thank you. We'll go to our next question from Carlton Evans. Carlton, if you'd be kind enough to please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much. My question is this. It's in reference to your crisis intervention training. You stated that you have had already 54 of your officers to go through the training. When do you anticipate on the rest of your staff to go through the training? And with me understanding that you're going to probably have some new staff members coming in and new officers being sworn in, but when could you anticipate a higher percentage of your officers to complete the training?
So we're really challenged with circumstances with regard to CIT training. The first challenge is the fact that the CIT training is mandated by the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, and it has to be a program that's approved by them. So we can't just get the training from anybody. The ILETSB approved training programs are very few and far between. When they do have a training class, we might get one seat in it for one officer. We've tried to host classes here because normally when you host them, you'll get more seats. And that's worked really well for us, but it's gotten to the point where they're like, well, we can't always have it at your place. We have to move it around. So it's really a challenge to get a bunch of officers through it in a short amount of time. We've done pretty good, but we really just every time they release a class, we take the maximum number of slots we can get, which may be 1 or 2, and that may only happen 3 or 4 times a year, unfortunately, under the current system. The other problem is now with COVID, they've reduced the number of classes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Now I'll recognize Maggie Vandermeer. Maggie, if you'd be kind enough to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, and thank you for the presentation. My question is relating to equity, one of the goals of the Reimagining Police Pledge. I'm wondering, it sounds like you have a lot of records about the use of force, and I'm wondering if you have statistics that are broken down by racial demographics in terms of the use of force. And then related to that question is, you talked about cultural sensitivity training. I'm wondering if you have sort of a rigorous implicit bias training when it comes to use of force and how it's applied, especially because, when you talked about reasonable objectivity, it relies on a police officer's perception. And so understanding implicit bias is so important to that. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask whether Deputy Chief Baker or Chief Scarpelli will take this. Who's going to take the lead on this? Okay, you're both muted, so I'm waiting for one of you to please step forward. Brian, it looks like you unmuted, so I'm going to assume that you're going to take it. Thank you.
We certainly have bias-based training. I don't know that I would call it rigorous, and I don't know that I'd say it goes to the level that you're talking about. But we certainly discuss those issues, and we do it on a regular basis annually. So it's not something that the officers haven't heard before, but again, I'm not sure it's been to the level that you're expressing. When you talk about statistics, I do not have them available for presentation now. We do have the data, and we could certainly get the data, but that is not something that we have prepared for tonight.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize
I
Lauren.
was just going to add,
Oh, go ahead.
that in the past few years, we have run in the ADL to give everybody anti-bias training, as well as the Department of Justice for procedural justice and a few other programs. So we're by far ahead of many other agencies.
Tony, ADL is the Anti-Defamation League.
Yes.
Thank you. Lawrence Walters, if you'd kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. Actually, Maggie asked my question about the race data, but my follow-up to that would be, how often do you report those statistics? Do these statistics just come out in your annual report, or do you report them quarterly or monthly, or what's the frequency? Thank you.
Tony, Brian, one of you, please.
We release use of force statistics in our annual report once a year.
Thank
And
you.
we also report to the FBI's initiative on those 3 categories.
Brian, just from here out, I'm going to assume that you're going to answer all the questions unless there's something that is indicated differently by you or the chief or Sergeant Franklin. Melissa Villegas, if you would kindly unmute yourself and ask your question.
I had similar data or statistics related questions. I want to thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you're also able to slice and dice it based on gender and age groups, just to have a better idea just overall the demographics of who's most impacted. And also I think it could be really interesting to see or helpful to see for the use of force they've used, what the initial call was for or the type of crime that was being committed. Because I think that could be really informative as well, just to know, have some context behind a lot of the numbers that we're seeing. Because some numbers seem really high, like 700 something, but we don't know what's behind that or who it's really impacting the most in the community. So if you are able to provide that in future meetings or for the future, that'd be really great.
Duly noted, and I want to thank the group. I'm really heartened by the fact that a lot of the questions so far have been, you're wondering about statistics, and we have them, and we will do our best to pull them together and share them with you. So I appreciate your wanting some baseline data, so that we can have informed discussions as we go forward. I'll now recognize Laura Williams. If you kindly unmute yourself and ask your question, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have sort of a related question. Skokie has been offering seed training for several years, and it's free, and many of us have gone through it, and it's really a wonderful program. And I'm wondering how many members of the SPD have gone through seed training.
Well, you have
I've been through seed training. It was unfortunately, it was cut short for me for COVID reasons. So I went through the training until it was stopped for COVID. But I really enjoyed the program. I learned a lot from it. And just sharing experiences and getting to know people within the community was a really great experience. So I'm thankful I went.
Hey, Ann,
Yes.
I think we're running into our end of the meeting time.
We are. So what I'd like to do, thank you, Paul. We do have a handful of questions. Commissioners, might not get to you. So David and Ken Mantell, if we can, we will. What I'd like to do is this, because we are going overtime. Any of you who have other commitments, you have a child you need to get to bed, or you need your hot cup of tea before bed, whatever, feel free, if you need to drop off, please do so. Know that we will be in touch, as I said at the outset of the meeting, with links for you to sign up for your future meeting and for the opportunity of either a ride-along or a reality-based use of force training scenario one-on-one with the Skokie Police Department. The other thing I need to really quickly say before we conclude is that relative to citizen comments, we did receive one email over last night from a resident, Lewis Cooper. He had a number of questions. Deputy Chief Baker, we reviewed them today. Deputy Chief Baker addressed many of them in his presentation this evening, as did Sergeant Franklin. And Deputy Chief Baker also followed up with Mr. Cooper with a phone call today. That was the only community question, and we are required to read that at the end of the meeting. So again, anyone who needs to drop off, please go ahead and do so. It's 8:37. I'll commit to going to 8:50 for those of you who care to stay on. So the next person I'll recognize is Jasmine. If you would kindly unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you so much for agreeing to stay and answer the questions from the community. I really appreciate that. The first question I have is about the questions that the commissioners are going to put together for future meetings. I wanted to know if the community members, if we will be allowed to share questions that we will discuss in future meetings. That was my first question.
So I'll go ahead and take that one. You will have the questions in advance that we're going to center our discussions around, and really they're going to be very simple. I just think those discussions will be very productive if we center them around maybe 3 different questions. And I don't have them quite finalized yet, but I will in coming weeks, and I will send them out to you before the meetings. In terms of questions, yes, you will be able to come to those meetings with your own questions. So if you want to send them to us in advance, certainly you can. And one of the things that as our discussion has unfolded tonight that I've been thinking we might want to do would be to invite, if you care to, invite those of you who are participating and the commissioners certainly to send questions to me via email, to Deputy Chief Baker via email. And what we can do is to put together a question and answer sheet that we can send out to everyone. So that we're all, again, what I really want to do is have it so that everyone has the benefit of seeing what everyone else's questions are and what the answers are. So I'll perfect that, and I'll send out an email as a follow-up to this. But Jasmine, I hope I've answered your question. Yes. Bring your question.
I wanted that we were going to be able to shape like the policy that comes after all these meetings. So will our input be included in the decision?
Yes, it will be. And what will happen, just quickly, you did receive on Friday, I sent a number of documents, and I know you've really gotten a lot of paperwork over the last week, and it's a lot to digest. but you did receive a work plan, a work project outline. And once these meetings are concluded, the commission will take all of the feedback and information that they've received from the community. They will draft a recommendation, and that recommendation will be posted on the village website. Our goal is to have it posted during the month of May. I'm timing it specifically with when our village newsletter is issued so that we can announce that it's posted and open a window of, it will be at least a 3-week period of time where residents, including all of you, can comment on this, the draft recommendation. So that will all take place before it's finalized.
Okay, and then one more question. I will save the other questions because a few other people touched on my other points. The landlord training seminars, I was wondering, as I'm thinking about policing and people who rent in Skokie, and I was wondering what is focused on in those landlord training seminars, because I noticed that in the presentation in the neighborhood integrity program, which is also kind of focused on renting in Skokie. So I was just wondering how all that is connected, and if there's a place where I can go and look at the information that's shared in the landlord training seminars with landlords.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so in regards to the neighborhood integrity program, like Officer Marta Zigliano, he's a coordinator, but in those presentations, he meets with the landlords and tenants and just explains some of the ordinances that are with the village of Skokie. But he pretty much explains to the landlord what the rules are in regard to basically integrity of the village, like some of the rules, like say by chance if somebody is arrested for major offenses and like for drugs or robbery and things like that, and they're residing at a location that they're renting, and it keeps, like say, reports are happening at that location over and over again, that is part of again, that's against the neighborhood integrity ordinance. So those are one of the things where the landlord and the tenants can be in an agreement of these are the rules you'd like to abide. We'd like to have the quality of life within the village of Skokie very well for all citizens. So that's part of it. I can actually provide you, we have a pamphlet in my office where I can provide for you all of the information about the neighborhood integrity program if you're interested. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
If you could scan that and send it to me, Denise, I'll be sending out, again, guess what, more paperwork. I'll be sending that to all of you in a follow-up email, maybe not by the end of this week, but first part of next week. Okay, continuing with our questions in the time we have left, it's Nancy Graham's turn. Nancy, if you'd kindly unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation. It was very in-depth. I also had it written down that I wanted to ask about the neighborhood integrity ordinance. Can we have a copy of the actual ordinance, not just the program?
Yes, I can provide all that information. Mm-hmm.
And then my next question is, of the data you guys collected from the use of force chart, how many of those instances resulted in excessive force complaints? And how many of those were found to have used excessive force?
I don't have that exact number for you, because you asked how many were complaints of excessive force. I don't know that we capture that specific data. You know what I mean? Because every use of force gets a report. It's not like we wait for someone to complain about it. You know what I mean? So I have to look at the data to see if we can figure out which way it was generated. You know what I mean? Because one of the things that we do in our use of force investigations is our supervisors actually attempt to talk to the person who used force on, to get their perspective, to find out from them what happened. We don't just take the officer side of it. In terms of how many were improper, I don't have a number for you. I do know there are some that were improper, and training took place to educate the officer on what was improper. You know what I mean? So we have those numbers and we can get them.
Can we have those reports of anything recent that was deemed improper?
Or we have to, like, you want the actual write-up?
Like the actual incident report, Nancy?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we probably can because it's public information. I need to double check that by our FOIA, our Freedom of Information Act officer. So let us talk about that and we'll come up with a plan to get you some information. And Nancy, if I need to touch base with you individually to just let you know what our plan is and see if it satisfies what you're looking for, we'll go that route as well. So we'll do our best to provide you with the information you're looking for. Okay, Allison Bauman.
And just for 1 second.
Yes.
On that point, and just to interject the question, Chief, is any of that information considered part of the employees' information that can't be released to the public because it's between the employee and the village?
Well, again, as Ann stated, we have to check with what FOIA would allow and what it wouldn't allow. But I do have a comment. I only, in the past year or two, recall one instance where the force was deemed improper. And Deputy Chief Baker mentioned that the officer is, receives additional training, but they also can receive discipline. And in the one instance that I do recall, the officer received training and discipline. And essentially, the officer used force to make an arrest before the case was fully investigated and the probable cause to arrest was solid. It was premature force that was used. It was premature to the conclusion of the investigation when he went to take the person into custody, and they were disciplined for it. I don't recall any other improper conduct findings of the uses of force. And again, as Deputy Chief Baker mentioned, each and every one is thoroughly investigated.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you, Chairman Patalis. Nancy, one last thing I'd like to say is, when the time comes that when we are able to release some things, and again, we'll look into that. Expect that there may be some information that's redacted because sometimes we have to do that. It would be, really identifiers for the individuals who are involved. But again, we'll vet all that with our Freedom of Information Act officer, and if we need to, our human services staff as well. So thank you for that question. Allison Bauman, you're up now. If you'd kindly go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much for a great presentation too. I learned a lot tonight. I have a question that's twofold. One, sort of on the back of Nancy's question, is whether with excessive force, are you able to see patterns and track whether it's one officer or two officers or three officers, what the pattern of that is? And then as a result of use of force for the officer and for the community, what is the role of mental health, social work, trauma-informed responses? Is help and supports given to the officers when these things happen? Again, those are sort of my two questions.
Thank you. Brian, I assume you're going to take it unless Tony jumps in?
Yeah, I certainly can. So we have a personnel early warning system here at the police department where every quarter we review a whole host of data elements involving every single officer, whether it be complaints about that officer, traffic crashes, discipline issues, use of forces, etc. Anyone during that quarter that gets a certain number or combination of those things, it comes to the deputy chiefs for review. And that's what we have in place to make sure we catch anything that may be happening with regards to is a certain officer using force more than he should be, even though it may be proper, is there something going on? So that's what we have in place for that. And then the second part of your question had to do with kind of engaging other resources to deal with individuals instead of using force. Did I get that right?
Yeah, or sort of the effects. We all know that the effects of violence and the effects of force on the officer, I imagine, and also on the community is going to be pretty strong. And how do you combat that?
So here at the police department, we have a number of things. We have our own peer support program. It's formally established. It's got formal networks. It works very well behind the scenes with individuals, with a whole host of things that may be going on with everybody in their own lives, as we all have. We have our employee assistance program that's available. So between those things, we do a pretty good job, I think, of taking care of our mental health from the officer perspective, much better than we used to many years ago.
Thank you. We are at time, but I'm going to keep going for 5 more minutes. So if anybody needs to drop off, go ahead. Lisa Coleman, it's your turn. I really want to get to all of our community members. Lisa, I wasn't going to leave you hanging. So Lisa, please go ahead, unmute yourself and answer your question.
Thank you.
Ask your question.
Thank you. The presentation was excellent. Thank you for the information. Just a quick question, how many officers are on the police force right now in Skokie?
Chief, you want to take that?
Sure. The authorized, the budgeted number is 117, but at any given time, the actual will ebb and flow. So, for example, we have a sergeant retiring on November 2nd. I'm retiring on November 10th. We had somebody leave a few months ago, and it's people leave more quickly than you can backfill the person. So, it's a long, thorough process to hire somebody. So actually, we just had a Fire and Police Commission meeting on Monday night where 3 candidates were approved to go on to the next step. But assuming they're hired in June, they're probably not operational for about 5-6 months. Due to the training that Deputy Chief Baker alluded to. So there's also a hiring freeze in place, due to budget implications that have occurred because of COVID. So we do have a number of vacancies, but the village manager is allowing us to fill some of those vacancies. But ultimately, at some point, we would anticipate being back up to 117. So when Deputy Chief Baker went over the 5 years worth of statistics, some years we may have been near that number, some years it's any given year it's going to fluctuate, and fluctuates within the year. And hopefully that was a long-winded answer that fully answered your question.
Thank you, Chief Scarpelli.
We now have 2 commissioners who have questions. Quickly, David Fryrick, if you would go ahead, please.
Thank you. I typed in my question. It was with regard to the Illinois statute. It says a peace officer or any person whom he has summoned or directed to assist him. I'm just curious if you can offer context on who that person might be. Is that just a lay person, or would that be another officer? Or?
It could be you, David. So, I stop somebody for speeding in front of your house, and it turns out they're wanted on a warrant, and they do not want to be arrested. And the fight is on, and we're rolling around the grass, and you come outside, and I say, David, help me, I need help. Call, grab his arms or hold his legs. So it can actually be anybody.
Okay, thank you for that.
Finally, we'll go to Ken Mantell, another one of our commissioners. Ken, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Congratulations, Tony, and thank you, Deputy Chief Baker and Sergeant Franklin, for your presentation. My question has to do with cameras. We've heard a lot about police cameras and officers having on-body cams. Does the Village of Skokie, the police department, utilize body cameras? And if so, how many officers at a given time are outfitted with the cameras? I believe it's not just to see what's happening for evidence, but it's also for training purposes.
Ken, we do not. We have, Tony, help me. I want to make sure I get it right. Is it in-dash or dashboard cameras?
Yeah, we have in-car
cameras. There's information about this on the village website, Ken. It was posted over the summer, but Tony, and I will send the information to everyone. I'm going to make a note about that. But Tony, Brian, if one of you want to briefly address it before we conclude.
Yeah, currently we don't have a body-worn camera program, but I think it was two years ago, I went to the village board. Our in-car cameras were up for replacement. And the system we had in place then wasn't high definition cameras. It was just a forward-facing camera where we run in a 360-degree high-definition camera system. So if you can visualize the squad car, there's one that's forward-facing. There's one pointing out each side window. There's one that points out the rear window, and as well as one pointing to the passenger rear compartment. It's a very stable environment. Body-worn cameras, you're pretty much seeing whatever the camera sees, depending on the body angle of the officer. And it's quite an expensive program. We constantly keep up to date with the technology, and we're always looking for grants that may assist in funding a body-worn camera program. But the grant dollars are far and few between, and typically, the poorest communities receive the grant money before other communities. So while we have pursued things, we haven't been successful in obtaining a grant. So we're always watching out for it. And just another comment on the in-car versus body-worn camera programs. There was a couple communities that did a study as to what is captured on the in-car systems. And one community engaged, the research indicated that about 70% of the citizen police interactions were captured on the in-car camera. And I think the other community, it was about 80%. So generally, 75% of the interactions would be captured on the in-car camera system. And that was the in-car camera system that only got a forward-facing camera. So, we think our percentage would be about that same number, maybe even a little better. So, you probably can never have too much video, but some would be duplicative too. So, we're always, open to different and new programs, but, it's a difficult economic time, and we continue to watch for grant opportunities and, future funding, whether it's through local means or state means or federal means.
Thank you. I'd like to conclude by, once again, a couple of things. I'd like to thank Chief Scarpelli, Sergeant Franklin, Deputy Chief Baker for providing such a good presentation tonight. I'd like to thank all of you for participating, for your thoughtful questions. I would like to congratulate Chief Scarpelli again on his long and successful career. We will miss you, Tony. And watch for, you'll be getting some information via email. I have a growing list of a number of documents and other things I'll be sending you. Be checking in, if you could please, with your partners, if you have one from your organization, participating with you on which of these dates will work for you. November 18th, December 19th, January 20th. Know that that's different. There was a typo in the first letter you received. I inadvertently put down January 21st. It's January 20th. Or February 17th. We'll have limited spaces on each of those evenings, but you might want to check in with your partner, because we do need you, if you are one of two, we need you to sign up as a group. And then information also about the ride-alongs and the use of force-based, reality-based training scenario at the police department. Again, thanks to everyone, grateful to all of you, and watch for more information. Thanks to Eric Cook, our engineering director, for being at the controls. So thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Great meeting. Good night.
Thank you.